Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today.
It does sound sophisticated.
Sophisticated, yeah.
With the ACE community for 3 years now.
Actually outlined everything.
Something that we find in the society.
First, talk about the problems that you're trying to solve.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of Deep Random Talks. Today with us, we have Roxana, my co-host on product topics, and Amy, our awesome guest. So we are going to talk about a very, very interesting topic, personalization in healthcare and why that's important. So we are very excited to have you with us today, Amy. Thanks for joining us. Roxana, what's new with you?
I don't know. This morning has been fun. This night has been fun. It's a little out of season, but we've had prankers keeping us up all night. So hopefully the audience does not share my experiences.
Sounds fun. How about you, Amy? What's new these days?
Well, I'm actually headed to New York later today for a work trip, so I'm kind of excited. I'll get to see a friend while I'm there. And, you know, work trips are always a nice time to see my colleagues and get things done. And I'm coming off of a lovely fall weekend. I went to a drag brunch yesterday, which I've never done before. Friend's birthday. So it was a good time.
Fun times. What is everybody drinking? I'm drinking my medium roast hand grinded coffee. How about you?
I also have coffee in my behavioral groups mug. I get my coffee beans from a local place that has a collaboration with a brewery. So the coffee doesn't taste like beer, but I just like the idea of it.
Nice. How about you, Roxana?
It's mostly a latte, but the base, we got a Viet coffee. My husband makes Viet coffee to spoil me with lots of condensed milk once in a while. Except this one, he didn't pay attention, and it's strongly chocolate flavored. So it feels like cake in a cup.
That actually sounds good.
It is.
I'm going to visit you and have him make that.
Amy is usually one of the most modest, humble people I've met. So I wanted to do the first intro myself. It's funny. Literally, Amy is who I want to be when I grow up. But the difference between us is not that big. So hopefully I'll grow up fast. But she's gotten her PhD in organizational psych years back. And really, to me, her journey has been the perfect example of bridging academia and industry to really advance fields and move mountains. And that bridge between academia and industry, like, you didn't stop there. Now, as the VP at behavioral design, now you're bringing together disciplines, right? Behavior change, design, and AI to improve better health at the personal and population level. Like, that's huge. That's everything.
So, Amy, you have been working for quite a bit of time in healthcare personalization, even back in the day when you had to sit down and handcraft heuristics for these kind of things. So let's go back in history in early days. So where did your career start? What was it like? Let's start.
Yeah, I always like to tell people that the beginning of my career was a series of happy accidents because I was completing my PhD and I had realized I did not want to go into an academic job. Even though I love a lot of parts of what you do as an academic professional, it just wasn't quite the right fit for me. And I really wanted control over where I lived was a big thing too. I was newly engaged. I didn't want to be on this job market where you don't really get to choose where in the country or the world that you live. And found this job right out of grad school doing research for an agency that was mostly actually helping pharmaceutical companies with their big quarterly sales meetings, which not my thing, but I learned how much I loved healthcare and how important behavior science could be for healthcare. There really wasn't a lot of application of that kind of framework or lenses that I could see at that time. And then as part of that job, I was doing competitive analysis, like what are companies out there that are working with pharmaceutical companies and, creating different sorts of products for patients or consumers. And I stumbled across a product by this company called Health Media. And it was this really cool platform. They had built it for Takeda for one of their diabetes products. And it was this like personalized web coaching program, but for some reason it wasn't gated. Like anybody could go in and use it. So I went in and I was playing around with it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this thing is personalizing. Like you enter in your information and it's giving you this really personal coaching plan that's obviously based in behavior science. And so I'm Googling the company, and they were 2 miles from my house, and they were hiring for content writers. And that ultimately isn't really where my career has gone, but I'm a strong writer. I've always liked it. And I did understand what they were trying to do with personalization. I remember the job application included like a little exercise where they gave you 3 profiles, patient profiles, just like a paragraph or 2, and asked you what a coaching plan might look like for each of them. And they were really trying to see, do you understand personalization? And so just very luckily, I kind of did. So, did well in the interview, got the job. I actually was only a content developer at Health Media for maybe a couple weeks, certainly like not even a couple months. Very quickly my role changed, and I ended up really getting into the product design space there. I would say that's the place where I learned how to do behavioral design, to really apply my academic training to the product space. But like you said, and especially looking back now and knowing what we can do with technology, it's such a trip to think about how manual it was. Like we were really writing these personalization algorithms in detail. We were doing this rudimentary coding, like if the person is highly motivated and their source of motivation is extrinsic and they have had past barriers related to, then. So really, a lot of labor to create all that personalization. And I think it was really excellent. Like I'm very proud of the work that we did. And I think it was really effective in creating this engaging experience for patients. But also looking back, I'm like, wow, we have come such a long way.
And one of the interesting anecdotes I think that you told us on the coordination call was the trip to India. That was a bit of a turning point in your experience.
Yeah. So Health Media was acquired by Johnson & Johnson not that long after I started working there, although with these company acquisitions, it always takes a few years for them to really bring you into the fold and kind of make you one of their companies. So this was a few years in, and we became something of a shared service within J&J. So we were hired by LifeScan, which was also a Johnson & Johnson company at the time. They make diabetes test strips and meters for people to check their blood sugar. And one of the things that they'd observed in their sales data worldwide is that even though type 2 diabetes has been on the rise in India for some time, their sales of strips in particular, not the meters, but the strips, was not nearly what you'd expect. And it was because, at least at the time, this was like 2010. So if anything I'm saying has really changed, please forgive me. I haven't been there in a long time. People were testing their blood sugar roughly like 2 times a week rather than 5 times a day, which is more typical for what the clinical recommendations are, for all kinds of reasons. And LifeScan basically, in the interest of improving their test strip scale sales, but also helping people with type 2 diabetes more effectively manage it, sent a team of us to India to do research in clinics all around the country and really understand, what are the barriers that are making it hard for people with type 2 diabetes to manage their condition, including the test strips, but also thinking about things like diet and exercise and medication, really the whole thing, education, understanding the condition. It was one of the most exciting and fulfilling projects I've ever worked on. Like I just learned so much and really enjoyed the opportunity to step outside of my comfort zone and really understand how much culture plays a role too and how people experience health. One of the things that we learned on that trip that I had never encountered elsewhere, at least not so prominently, there were some regions where women, despite being I think globally this is sort of true, where women manage the household and then manage the health of others in the household, including their own health. But there were some places we went to where the women tended not to be educated. And so they may not know how to read. And that's a huge barrier when you think about I need to educate you on how to eat differently for your type 2 diabetes, but I can't give you written instruction sheets. So seeing that firsthand was really kind of life-changing. It was also one of the first opportunities I had to really think about service design, which has become a big part of my approach as well, really thinking about the experience that goes around the digital. Because one of the things that happened in India, and this again makes total sense, but didn't really click until I was there, is that people at the time at least didn't have high-speed internet at home. We couldn't create a purely digital product and expect people to self-serve. So we really had to think about other modalities. We built a lot of functionality that used simple text messages. We really thought about the in-clinic experience and having people work closely with an educator, do group classes, things like that, that in the US we didn't include in our design. But in India, if we really wanted to capture people and get them to participate, we needed to offer more than just online. So it was just kind of mind-blowing thinking about how much I didn't know and all of the different tools available that we could bring to bear to help solve this problem in this new context that really hadn't been a part of my toolkit before, but became part of it.
It's funny listening you talk. I'm kind of like in two ends of the spectrum. Part of it, like my first thought was you talked about that if logic, and that's really what I do internally for my family. This is how we function, and then that's how we drive behavior change as a very small scale internally. And then obviously there's been tons of advancements. So we no longer have to do that. So I'd love to hear you talk about those advancements and how we've moved from that if logic. But then the other part of what you said, and that kind of relates to some research I'm doing now too, is like, well, that digital barrier still exists in some places.
Part of where my J&J India experience impacted me too is realizing that even though it may not be so extreme, a lot of these issues do exist globally. And, most of my work is in the US context, but we still have people who have literacy in general barriers, health literacy barriers, health numeracy, digital access. I've been with Lirio, my current company, for about 1.5 years now, and we primarily use email and text message as the way to reach out to people, which it's funny because it's the most sophisticated company I've ever worked for, but the methods that we're using to reach people are fairly old school. And part of the reason why is because they do tend to be more accessible to people. There's research that shows over 90% of people have an email address, for example, and that's our most common channel to reach out to people. It's not perfect. It's not capturing 100% of people. And even something like text message, which most people do use, there's a lot of people who use pay-as-you-go phones, for example, and may have different phone numbers month to month or year to year, which sometimes limits your ability to, continually communicate with them about their health. But it still captures a really big portion of the population. So it's sort of like, it's not perfect, but it's okay. It's better than some of the alternatives. And I think that's an area where we can really keep pushing to improve. I actually, when I worked for CVS Health, which was quite a while ago as well, but I worked for the specialty pharmacy, which is the medications that are sometimes tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So everybody has this really big vested interest in making sure that people are taking them correctly. And they had a program where, because of that issue of people having the pay-as-you-go phones, they were actually giving people cell phones for the duration of their therapy, and just be like, hey, we're going to text you about your medication adherence on this phone, and you can keep it, but it's so important to us that you're taking this medication. So yeah, the channel communication is definitely a continuing challenge. I think it's really exciting to think about something like a wearable-based intervention, but wearables, of course, are expensive and they're not accessible to everybody. And so these tools like text message and email can maybe even the playing field a little bit. On the if-then side, one of the things that really attracted me to Lirio is that we use artificial intelligence to do the personalization. And there is still a human element to it. So we have our behavioral science team, which I lead, and then we have an artificial intelligence team that's led by Dr. Chris Simons. And we really have to talk very closely to each other about what we're each trying to achieve in order for, the behavioral designers to design an intervention that uses the AI correctly, but then the AI to actually do the personalization. And so we're really thinking about target behaviors. What are we trying to get people to do? And in the AI context, there has to be data associated with that. Like, the AI can't learn if it's not getting information about what's happening in the world. And so we have to think about things like scheduling and attending an appointment, because there is data associated with whether or not that happened that is accessible to a machine learning system, as opposed to, somebody reading hard copy education at home. It would be very difficult for us to know if that had happened. So we really look for those sorts of behaviors that have that kind of data pattern associated with it. And then my team is creating these content libraries that are all based around the behavioral determinants for that behavior. And the AI is learning to recognize which behavior science techniques are similar to each other, which ones might be different to each other. We do this very cool semantic conversion of the content that translates it into this, I want to say 3D, but I think it's more than it's a multi-dimensional space that the AI is able to make sense of. And it's so cool to see it as a human who's trained in behavior science, because if you look at how the AI is mapping techniques, it's actually doing an awesome job recognizing things that are similar to each other versus things that are different to each other. So it's basically figuring out, based on what a person's responding to, what are the behavior science techniques that might be right for them the next go around. If we want to get them to do this behavior again, or if we weren't successful the first time at getting them to do the behavior, what might be a better thing to try? And so over time, it's just basically able to select what is the right technique for this person.
You've been working in the field for a while, and the typical approach used to be, long surveys on people's motivations and tasks, and then building heuristic algorithms to figure out, how they should behave in certain ways. And maybe you can talk about how that heuristic integrated into their workflow a bit. But the things that were wrong with those assumptions, or maybe not wrong, but the constraints that existed at the time was, digital literacy, health literacy, were problems from the receiver point of view, but from a technology and product point of view, also things like a scalability, ability to capture context, ability to capture drift in behavior. All of these were things that were left out. Is that a fair summary of where things were?
Yeah, absolutely. And that last one we didn't talk too much about, but that's a big one too, that people change over time. And that's kind of the purpose of a lot of these interventions. We want people to change. We want you to have that first experience with a mammogram so that you're no longer not doing it because of fear of the unknown. But even with our personalization technology back in 2007 onward, we couldn't necessarily accommodate for that. There was nothing smart in the system to do that. We would reach out to people and try to get them to do a 3 and a 6 month update. But, people, like you said, they're long questionnaires. There's still all of these other barriers. It was very, very difficult to get people to update their information over time. And so they're kind of left with this one point in time personalization when, in fact, people are so dynamic and just really change so much over the lifespan.
Would you say behavior change is hard? Because on one hand, we are adaptable and we're great at it. But on the other hand, like we've all tried to change something and failed miserably. So what are the factors that determine which is it and when is it one or the other?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm like frequently quoted saying that behavior change is hard. And I do think behavior change is hard, but it's not always hard, to your point. There's some things that behavior changes that fit for people. And I know we all experience this in our own lives where there's certain things where we're probably going to be successful when we try them because they fit our strengths, our preferences. We maybe don't have a lot of barriers around that particular behavior in our lives. And then others where we struggle and probably will always struggle. Like I have some of my own personal health behaviors. As much as I understand the science about how to do it, doesn't make it easy to make it happen. And I do think a lot of it has to do with who we are as people. There is something enduring about, our strengths and our preferences, and also our contexts. Like, depending on who you live with and where you live and what your job is and what kinds of resources are available to you, that might really complicate certain types of behavior change. It's also whether you're interested in doing it. Sometimes there are goals that people want to achieve, but they're not necessarily ready to do the concrete steps that will help them get to goal. I see this a lot with health behavior stuff. And I'm also really sensitive to because weight management, weight loss is the one that comes up a lot. And I'm not necessarily like everyone's got to lose weight and be a healthy weight. But for so many health conditions, that's part of it. And people really struggle with it. They want the result. They want to get to goal where it's like, yeah, now I'm whatever weight I want to be. But the behaviors that get you there are really, really hard for people, including for me. Like that's an area where I struggle a lot, especially on the nutrition side, because, I grew up in a household where food was love and that's how you socialize. And that's been an enduring barrier for me. That's like a mental model. It's super, super hard to change. But something like getting exercise is not really a challenge for me. I don't have barriers the same way around that. So I think it can be both easy and hard. It's a little bit like, a river flowing where the water is going to flow, but can you direct it where you need it to be?
Like I know the science of it and obviously the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, but I don't think I felt it until a year and something ago when I was pregnant. So my body can't tell that I'm thirsty. I have no concept of thirst. That I don't know what's wrong with me. No one has figured out the answer, but I could go a day or two without water unless I force myself. And many times I would. until I realized I'm pregnant. Then I switched and it's been I do New Year's resolutions. I'm one of those people. It's been on my list for many years, miserably failed until that day. I went to 2+ liters a day, every single day, no exception. It was not hard, nothing. Everything changed in a second. And it's like, I've talked about this for so long. Now I can truly talk about it beyond the journal articles I've read. But then the other side of it, right, for extrinsic motivation, like we talked a bit about, in our pre-conversation about nudges, like how do we go about helping people with behaviors where the barriers are there and the motivation is not that ideal one?
And nudges are something that I think is useful in the right context. And by the way, Lirio's product is called Precision Nudging. So we do use a broader toolkit than just nudges, but it's an area I find that I end up speaking to a lot because I'm working with a product that has it in its name. So I really think of nudges as being very good at getting people to take action in the moment when there is a decision to do or not do. And if you can take advantage of people's cognitive biases with a well-timed and placed nudge, you can make it more likely that they take the desired action. So with our product at Lirio, we use it a lot in our email subject lines because you see something in your inbox and it's kind of a low commitment decision to open that email or not, but we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of the way that people think in such a way that they're interested in looking at that message. And then in the body, we deliver other behavior change techniques. So there's a little bit more real estate there too. So you can kind of do something more complex, like addressing somebody's mental model of why they may or may not need a mammogram. Because a big barrier to mammogram is people may say, I have no family history of breast cancer. I have no symptoms. I've done the self-exam. I don't feel any lumps. I really don't need to do this. When in fact, the risk benefit analysis there is you should still go get the mammogram. You're better off doing that because if you God forbid, do have a problem, you're much better off catching it now. So if we can use the nudge to get somebody to open the email, then we can talk to them a little bit about that mental model and hopefully make some change there. I have this idea myself that I've never been able, because I'm not a visual person. I feel like there's a cool graphic out there. And if anybody wants to try making this, but I think you can use nudges really successfully to get people to initiate a behavior change journey, like in incentives too, incentives as a version of a nudge. But at some point, you need to transition them to more of a motivational reason to be engaging this behavior. When I was at J&J, one of the things that we experimented with that I thought was really successful and really promising, and this was, again, around weight loss type stuff, because it takes a while after you make behavior changes to actually see a change in your weight. And so people will sometimes get frustrated because they change their diet, they change their exercise, they're kind of struggling through all of these new behaviors, and then they're not seeing their outcomes when they step on the scale. And it's like, why am I doing this? And so we were working to see if we could attune people to other changes that happen earlier than weight loss. And we were focused specifically on energy. So we ran all these little studies where we were having people monitor their energy levels like at baseline and then, try this. We actually mixed in a condition where we had people swish with Listerine, which is a Johnson & Johnson product. And it really actually improves your energy in the short term. So that sort of like painful minty mouth sensation does make you feel more energetic. So maybe we should have all done that before this since it's so early for us all. But if you can sort of give people some of those motivational reasons, like, okay, maybe I'm not moving towards my weight loss goal right now, but I am feeling more energized. And that's something I value. It's something that supports who I want to be as a person and all of these other tasks in my day. Like there's a weaning point almost. Can you get people to stop thinking about the fact that my alarm prompted me this morning to do my workout? And instead now I'm thinking, maybe I want to do this workout because it's going to make my whole day better.
It's very interesting to listen to you talk about these because I've been reading the book called Nudge recently that talks a lot about choice architectures and how, they affect our behavior. And I see, some examples that you gave there in terms of what kind of choice architectures we can create for people. So what I'm wondering, as a follow-up to that is, now we are living in a data-driven environment, right? So, and we and you are creating products that use data to figure out what kind of choice architectures and nudges are available and can be provided to the user. So if you want to, very quickly summarize on a high level, what are the types of interventions that we can provide that even go beyond just, nudging people to do something, that are data driven and, have a higher likelihood of, enabling people to do things that are good for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to summarize in terms of like a list of here's the three types of interventions, but I think the qualities of the interventions that do that are, first of all, that they do follow people over some period of time, not forever. In fact, I'm a big proponent of you don't need to engage people forever. You just need to engage them long enough so that they either reach the goal that they've set for using your intervention, or you've equipped them to reach the goal. And that's one of the things we used to talk about a lot at Health Media, is that because we were giving people such a huge chunk of coaching content all at once, we were basically giving them this entire education in a one shot. And if they didn't come back and use the tools, that wasn't necessarily bad. Oftentimes they would have what they need to get to the goal. And so really thinking like, what is the right amount of intervention to deliver to somebody so that they can achieve what they're trying to achieve? But it does, I think one and done is probably not the right method to get people to go there. So following people for some period of time, having that capability of changing. There is an approach that is relatively new. Like I learned it in my job and not in school because it didn't exist when I was in school, but just-in-time adaptive interventions, or JIDIs, is something that I think are a really promising way to deliver interventions, where you really start to understand when behaviors unfold over time, and you give people those prompts or those interactions with the intervention at specifically and deliberately timed intervals. So we've used a little bit of that approach in our Lirio product. So for example, with our colonoscopy product, because we're focused on getting people to schedule and attend that colonoscopy, but you have to go through your bowel cleanse prep prior to that. And so we can message people like right at the time that they're supposed to be doing these behaviors, so that in addition to educating them up front that this should happen and making sure that they're prepared for it, we're also giving them that prompt like, okay, it's go time.
We have this conversation, right, about ultimate personalization. The right way, or to achieve it, you require both behavior change and user feedback, UX approaches, and data driven and AI. But let's say there's a new product, there's a new condition, we want to change this behavior. Like, which one comes in and how and where do they merge?
Answer that my AI colleagues would give that's going to be different and probably more correct in terms of the AI than mine. But I think it does start with the behavior science there. And that's the way I've seen it unfold with the work, where we map out the behaviors that we're trying to achieve and what the action paths look like associated with those, and sort of bring it to our colleagues in AI. We're also doing a lot of our own research around those behaviors. And then we always do a robust literature review about the behavioral determinants, and all that's baked into the content. So, I mean, you're an expert in this too. We use COM-B and identify the intervention functions and then the related behavior change techniques. And so there's this whole logic mapped out behind the scenes of what's in our content libraries. And our AI colleagues are able to bring that into their algorithms. So there's some level, I mentioned they do a semantic conversion of the actual content items that shows which ones are similar and dissimilar from each other. But even beyond that, if there's things that we uncover in our literature review that say, okay, if someone is, meets these demographic criteria based on the research, chances are they're more likely to experience this subset of barriers. We can have the algorithm incorporate that and start off in that place. And that means it's not starting from zero intelligence. We also train algorithms with training data. I don't know a ton about how exactly that happens, but I do know that that's part of it. And then we're working on something called transfer learning as well, which is basically about having the entire intelligence layer of our product get smarter, so that if we have a new customer come on board and use one of our programs, even though we're sort of creating a fresh instance for that customer, and we're not applying data that belongs to somebody else, but the algorithm has actually been trained on other, patient populations. So it's not coming in with zero knowledge. It's coming in with some knowledge that it's gained elsewhere in the world. And then the last piece of where it starts is, again, like those behavioral responses from people. So right away, I mentioned if we tell it, if a person meets this demographic profile, try these sorts of messages, or assume that these barriers might be more likely. If we're wrong with that, if somebody doesn't resemble the group that they belong to demographically, which of course happens all the time, the AI will figure that out, because the person won't respond to those messages. They, won't have the desired outcomes. And so one of the things that I think is really promising about this sort of approach is that we can sort of front load it with all of our best understanding of the world as based on prior research, based on our own research. But if we're wrong for some reason, it's out there doing its own little mini experiments and creating intelligence about what actually works for each individual. So it feels like a nice balance between equipping it with the best possible knowledge, but then also knowing that if we've made a mistake for some reason, there's a fail-safe.
Clarification and context around transfer learning, because that's one of the most interesting developments that has happened in the past 5 to 10 years in field of AI. And for anybody who's less familiar, the idea is that, when we're training algorithms from scratch, like for example, if it is an algorithm that is reading text or reading documents, you have to first teach it how to read any sort of text, any sort of language. And then on top of that, you have to teach it the nuances of something that is said. For example, in this case, well, I have no familiarity with the product, but I'm guessing that, for example, the algorithm learns how to just read general natural language, general text first. And that part of the training can be transferred to another patient without, retraining it from scratch every time. So definitely, there are a lot of interesting things that you can do to save time and compute and, train it. Like pre-trained language models is a very, very commonly used component of a lot of, text-based algorithms. So definitely very interesting. And I'm sure you're used in other types of transfer learning as well. But one of the things that I usually have experienced in my corporate life now, in my startup life, and I see it in our community as well, is that especially in an area like healthcare, where there is the healthcare component, there is the behavioral science component, there is the AI and data component, and probably a few other functions that have to come together to create the product team. These are functions that are traditionally very siloed. And, back in the day in my corporate life, the pattern was that this team does a bit of thing and then throws it over the wall to this team that does a bit of thing. It was just a hot potato in the air all the time and without any owners. And so how does that work? Like, have you figured out a pattern for this to work effectively?
Yeah, I've had the same experience, and I won't say we've totally solved it, but I do think that we have a pretty good thing going at Lirio. By the way, I've worked on innovation teams a few times, and that's been a consistent frustration because the big companies, especially, will set up a unit specifically dedicated to trying to be innovative and do new approaches. And sometimes you see really great work, and it's so hard to get it back into the main product line, to get it integrated with what's happening elsewhere. So, oh man, I feel that in my soul. But one of the things I was really attracted to at Lirio, when I was interviewing, I wasn't totally sold on even going for a new job at that point. But when I talked to Chris Simons, the head of the AI science team, it was apparent that they work really closely with the behavior scientists. And that was incredibly appealing to me because of exactly what you were talking about, like doing things a little bit differently. So we at Lirio call anybody who works on the product, like the sort of outward facing part of our work, the factory. And we use a version of the Agile framework for how the factory work happens. So we have all kinds of ceremonies over the course of a week, and then we do these 10-week program increments, PIs. So we have all of these opportunities baked into our process for the different teams to actually come together and talk about how their various contributions ladder up into the product output. And I think on the science side in particular, it's really clear sometimes how we have to collaborate and work together. And the other thing that actually works really well with our two science teams is that we're nerds. Like everybody on both of the science teams is a total nerd. And so it's fun for us to get into a room and hear about this totally different scientific approach that's not the way we were trained, and think about how to incorporate it. Like, I think it's just a group of people who really like that. So it's not a difficult battle to get it to happen. Where we've had missteps and we're actively working on getting better is making sure that the platform is also brought into that. So the actual technology that brings the science to life. I mentioned with our colonoscopy program, we added those messages, the just-in-time messages that are about getting people to do their bowel cleanse at the right period of time. It turned out that was actually a difficult thing to implement on the technology side, to do messaging that was based on the date and time of a scheduled appointment. we can do it now, but it was one of those things where from our perspective, it seemed super easy. We built out all of our functionality from our perspective. And then the platform team was like, excuse me? So we've gotten a lot better at having those conversations really early in the process now. And I think also recognizing when something that seems very straightforward from a behavior intervention standpoint might actually be complicated from a technology standpoint. So, we do a lot now when we're launching a new product or thinking about launching a new product, setting up those meetings really early with specific other teams, because it's like, okay, we now realize that if we're going to do something that has timing is a great example, like the timing of the message may have implications for the platform. And so if we're doing anything that's different from a previous intervention, that's a signal that we should get together and have those conversations. I think because we're small, we're able to kind of figure it out as we go. But as we grow, I think it's going to have to be something that's a little bit more baked into the process. It totally hear you on that being a challenge with the innovation.
There's like two thoughts that came to mind. Just thinking of our audience, part of it being more on the AI side and just kind of taking on the research endeavor. I'm really glad you brought up earlier the literature review, because coming from academia, that's a part that I think it's really, really underestimated in industry. But I wanted to, and then the combi model, which I'm not sure everyone is familiar with.
Yeah, I think you need, if not a researcher, someone who understands research and can create some kind of logic map on the back end of your product. So, it's, again, assuming it's a behavioral intervention, like someone who can really identify a target behavior and understand what that means, that it's, it's an action that happens, that it should be something that's measurable and very specific, and you're able to recognize it. Because I'm sure, as you've seen as well, sometimes people who aren't trained in behavior science, if you ask them to do target behavior, they'll be like, oh, losing weight, which is an outcome, not a behavior. So someone who can really understand that, someone who is capable of surveying the literature. So that doesn't necessarily need to be a researcher, but if you can at least leverage existing research because you have someone on your team who understands it and is able to parse it and distill the important elements of it into whatever you need for your product. I do think Combi is a wonderful tool to use because it's intuitive to people. So for folks who don't know it, it's an acronym, COM-B. The B is behavior. And the idea is that for someone to perform a behavior, they must have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to do it. So if you look at the reasons why people may not accomplish that behavior, you can, by and large, categorize them as either belonging to capability, opportunity, or motivation categories. And then depending on what you observe, there are certain techniques that are more effective at solving that problem for people. So it's really just a way to organize that universe of what's happening around this behavior. And it's a great tool because it does, people can pick it up pretty quickly and it integrates very well with other approaches. So I've used it with all kinds of UX teams, for example. And a UX researcher, it's not that difficult for them to adjust their question sets, for example, so that they start to ask a little bit more about the behaviors and what makes this behavior hard for you and what makes this behavior easier for you. So,
well, for this perfect collaboration to happen, so part of it, I think you've already answered, is at Lirio, at least there's all these opportunities to bring behavior change scientists and AI experts in the same room. But then is that enough in terms of like actually having a common language? I remember reading a paper where I think it was about natural disasters, and there were environmental scientists and then AI experts and so on. And really, I think I may be making this up, but there was a number that was high enough that they spent the discussion around tweets. And then they realized it means very, very different things. Like, well, to one, it means the words, that's the sentence, the phrase, whatever it is. To the other, the AI expert, all of the hundreds of fields associated with it and geolocation and whatever else may be in there. But the conversation kept going on because the word tweet resonated with both, but in reality, it had so many different implications. So are those like collaborative sessions enough for the common language to emerge, or are there active steps towards ensuring that you guys speak the same language?
Yeah, we've had so many of those situations too, where, we use similar terminology to mean really different things. And after a few years of being a company and working together, again, we've figured a lot of those out. but it does come up sometimes still. We just did a little collaboration where submitted and had accepted to an AI conference a paper that was a collaboration between behavior science and AI. And it was around, could we use behavior science to create an algorithm that can predict some people's nutritional choices? And we realized that we have different conceptions of what it means to predict something. So on the AI side, like mathematically, they want to absolutely 100% like know what the behavior is going to be. And on the behavior science side, we're pretty satisfied if we can get like 80% of the way there, because like people are weird, right? You might make a random decision one day just because you're in the mood or whatever. But if 80% of the time we're right, then overall on a behavioral journey, we're going to be in pretty good shape. And so we had this really interesting back and forth about what does it mean to actually successfully predict somebody's behavior, and what is an acceptable threshold in terms of percentage of time. So I think even more than it is an active process. And I think it's important as the people involved that you are willing to just understand that your approach isn't going to be the right approach, that together we have to talk through the way that we are approaching this problem and figure out, where we want to meet on that. And that is an art and not a science. I mean, we very well could say like, we're absolutely going to go with the AI approach because this is an AI paper, or we're going to go with the BSci approach because we're trying to predict a behavior. But being willing to have that conversation, negotiate, and collectively agree on what the best outcome is really what it's at. And I think that's kind of an attitude more than a process.
I'm glad the example you used is nutrition, because some conversations that I've had recently, and that kind of takes us into kind of ethically responsible practices, right? Like ultimately, where do you draw the line in terms of I'm predicting behaviors and nudging towards a desired outcome versus there's always a business side. So how do you combine those two, and where's the line?
Yeah. And, one of the things that's important to me as a behavior scientist who works in industry is to sort of stay true to the ethics that I was trained with, around how we treat human subjects. If I'm using the research language there, I mean, I don't call our customers human subjects, but, really being careful, for example, that we frequently consult an IRB. So we have specific research projects, which obviously we take through an IRB, but even in terms of our overall approach, like we work with an IRB to make sure that we are doing it ethically, that we are making sure that we're protecting people's autonomy and their ability to make decisions about their experience. It's a hard thing sometimes to talk to a customer organization and, they're really fixated on an outcome. Like we really want to reduce healthcare costs. We really want to reduce the incidence of heart attacks, whatever it is. And to come in with this ethical belief of, allowing people to be non-adherent, like what is that? Volitional non-adherence, I believe is what they call it in the literature. Like people can say no, they can say, I'm not interested in doing this behavior thing. And as behavior scientists, the ethical thing for us is to respect that and to know that maybe someday they change their mind. So I always think of it this way. We have to plant seeds that if someone has something happen in their lives where now it's easier for them to engage in this change, or they have more of an interest, we've created that opportunity for it to happen, but we cannot force them to do it now because they're unlikely to be successful. I don't have a perfect answer. It definitely continues to be a point of friction, especially working with non-behavior scientists or with organizations that are really fixated on outcomes. One of the things I will say, though, is when we're working with some of these high stakes behaviors in large populations, you don't need to make a large difference in terms of percentage of the population to make a large difference in terms of business outcomes. And I think sometimes that buys us a little bit of breathing room, that we don't need to force people, because if we can get just 2% of your patients to do this thing differently, you will see a huge benefit to your organization. So sometimes looking at the bigger numbers can help give us a little bit of clearance in terms of being respectful of folks. But I think there's also just ground rules of ethics that we would never want to violate. And if it came down to not engaging with an organization that wasn't respectful of that, that's where we would be.
So the field of privacy preserving AI and ethical AI and responsible AI as a more broad, I guess, umbrella term is definitely evolving, because I don't think as a society we understand what that even means concretely. There are a lot of things that are clear, like, don't kill people, but there are that other 99% of things that are fairly gray, like, they could have consequences in a few with a few hops in terms of logical steps, right? So there are a lot of gray area items that we're still wrapping our heads around it, especially when it comes to algorithmic interventions. Because you could do that at large scale. You could very easily get into areas where you're manipulating people to do behaviors that are not their desired outcome, but rather, the desired outcomes of other entities, or you might be stepping on their privacy. You're collecting data that is unnecessary for a specific activities and outcomes you're looking for. But definitely, the field is moving fast. Hopefully keeping up. There are a lot of researchers on the responsible AI side, that are coming up with ideas and frameworks, and fortunately, more recently, development tools that enable us to measure how risky some of the activities that we're doing are and data sets that we're using are. And I'm excited to see things like federated learning, where people can keep their private data where it is, and we still can serve them a specific type of nudges and outcomes that they're looking for. So definitely very interesting. And one of the things that you said and really resonates with me is one of my very favorite product design tools recently is design sprints. We have started doing that in my company about 6 months ago, and design sprint itself is for those who are less familiar, that's like a few days that you just bring in all the stakeholders, ethics team and product people and engineering and marketing and anybody who will touch the product in some level, and just force them to talk to each other. And usually, in my experience, the outcome of that design sprint, like the design itself, is something that needs still probably a lot of work, but people start talking. And that's very, very important, because those conversations continue at least for a while afterwards. So, creating that common language, like, it just ignites that creation of the common language in the team. So a lot of interesting conversation, a lot of interesting topics to go down rabbit holes, but unfortunately we are almost out of time, and I would love to get the verdict. So maybe Roxana, for you, I'm curious, these are things that you think about every day, but is there anything that was an interesting takeaway for you, anything that you're going to think about differently going forward? And Amy, what's the call to action for people going forward? Roxana?
I think part of it is the collaborative piece. Like, we keep talking about that, right? But it takes work for it to happen and for it to be successful. So it's just not a one-time conversation. It's a established relationship that has to be ongoing between disciplines. And to me, that's kind of the real takeaway, because the outcomes are amazing when that happens. But there is a bit of initial investment to make it happen.
Yeah, I like that takeaway a lot. And I agree with you that that's a big part of the process. And I think in terms of the output, for me, what I keep coming back to in my career and in my work is we really do have to personalize, as hard as that can be to do. And when I say personalize, I really mean over time and across contexts, because people do change and they are very affected by the context that they're in. So just because an approach works for a person for one behavior, that may not be the same approach that you want to use for a different behavior, because every behavior is also contextually bound. It's really complicated, but I think if we want to be successful at changing people's behavior and helping them maintain changes over time, we really, really have to personalize.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me today, Amy and Roxana. This was a very fun conversation. As I said, we could probably go on for another 24 hours, but we have to move on to other things in our lives as well. Thank you so much for joining me, the audience, and hopefully we'll see you again next week with another episode of Deep Random Talks. Thanks for watching.